Welcome to UberCube, the podcast where we discuss all things cube, but with refreshments. This is your host, Anthony Adams, aka UberBear, and if you haven't noticed by now, sometimes I say with refreshments, and sometimes I say but with refreshments. I caught that recently, and we change that up often, don't we? We don't even mean to. Have you noticed that about that little but?
Obviously, I thought sometimes we said libations, too.
Yes,
we do.
That was what I was going to say, was
fun.
the whole libations
Refreshments,
thing.
libations, beer, scotch, wine, water.
I don't think
high quality H2O.
I don't think our choice of today can necessarily be considered a refreshment.
Bougie.
It's a libation.
Let's do the drink thing first, just because this one's great. We're just going to do something we don't do all the time, and we'll talk about a little intro after this.
Absolutely.
You gave me something to celebrate.
I did.
This is a wonderful single malt Macallan 15.
It's a Glenfiddich 15.
Okay, it's a single malt Glenfiddich 15 that you called Macallan when we were downstairs. You know that, right?
No, I showed you the bottle.
You definitely said Macallan.
No, I said Glenfiddich.
All right. Macallan / Glenfiddich 15.
Whatever it is.
It's delicious.
It's very good.
May, what are you having?
Much
May,
more.
what are you having on this delightful day since we just cut into we don't know what kind of scotch we're having? It's 15
I'm
years
just
old.
having water. I'm being responsible.
That's
Good
probably
for you.
15 years old too, plus. Little water.
The plus, yes. It's definitely
The
15
To be
years.
fair,
The whole rain
plus.
cycle.
Yeah.
My roommate and I recently got our water softener replaced. So we actually have soft water since we moved in. So now
Ooh.
enjoying some actual fresh water is
Very
nice.
nice.
Best part about soft water is you put that little dab of soap in your hair and you have to spend 45 minutes trying to wash all the soap off yourself.
That is true.
It's a consequence of soft water.
That is
Prepare
true.
yourself. So, today we actually have an interesting episode. If you haven't seen or read, and I'm going to start with the Netflix series because it's absolutely amazing. It's called The Three-Body Problem. I was just absolutely blown away with how amazing this show was on Netflix. Matter of fact, every time I see him, Stu, have you seen this yet so we can talk about it? Have you seen this yet so we can talk about it? He says, it's on my list.
It is on my list, but I've been too wrapped up in Louder Milk and another show I started watching called Ripley on Netflix. And if you haven't seen that one, it's killer.
Yeah, I'm going to watch it. I actually saw that today.
Very
It
good.
popped up today. So The Three-Body Problem, which I haven't read, is a book series written by Lu San Shin. I think I may have probably butchered that. It's not my native language, but I've been told by my good friend Chris that it's absolutely amazing, a must read. And after watching the series, it kind of inspired this episode conversationally in a weird way, because I'm going to title it The Three Jitte Problem. So, if we got to find a little link, a little hook, a little bridge here, that's how I went about this. I'm going to actually get around to reading that book, man. If you watch that series, you're going to want to know what happens next. May, have you seen this yet on Netflix?
Nope.
Add it to your list. It is so good. I saw people talking about it on Twitter.
Well, as Anthony had stated, we're going to preempt this before we really get into it. The universe just has a really weird way of working against Anthony.
It does.
Sometimes. And this episode is going to cover one of those moments where, whether it be dark matter or a collapsing neutron star or black holes colliding, something happened out there in the great cosmos. And we have had one of those effects on magic. And Anthony, tell us about the euphoria you felt when you saw the card that's in the middle of our show notes, because it's the newest addition to this 3 Jitte problem. And it's basically what the whole episode is going to revolve around, is these 3 copies of this iconic magic card.
So there's a little bit of an origin story here. So Umezawa's Jitte, which we've talked about extensively at this point. We talked about it being in the almost legendary cube and how everybody screamed and rioted whenever it just emerged.
And rightly so.
And rightly so. And then along came the Fallout series, and they made just something that was near to dear in my heart, the Pip-Boy 3000. And for those that aren't familiar, it's for 1 colorless. You get the Pip-Boy 3000 artifact equipment. Whenever equipped creature attacks, choose one. Sort inventory. Draw a card, then discard a card. Pick a perk. Put a 1/1 counter on that creature, or you can check map. Untap up to 2 target lands, and it's equipped 2. So for pay 1, equip 2, I was blowing up every social thing saying, oh my gosh, this is the next Jitte. I think that was approximately 2.5, 3 weeks ago.
About that, yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And lo and behold, what card comes out approximately I don't know, this week.
Did you actually call it the Lost Jitte?
No, I just called it like, you guys need to get this. This is the next Jitte.
I think you should lie to everyone who listens to this podcast and just tell them that you called Pip-Boy 3000 the Lost Jitte. And then lo and behold, as we see here, we now have a card and it's actually called Lost Jitte. So this is another legendary artifact equipment. This is a 1 colorless to cast and 1 colorless to equip. And it has the following. Whenever equipped creature deals combat damage, same as Jitte, put a charge counter on Lost Jitte, remove a charge counter from Lost Jitte, choose 1, untap target land, target creature can't block this turn, or put a +1/+1 counter on equipped creature. And again, this is equip 1, cast 1. This really is the Lost Jitte, and I kind of feel that this exists in a kind of middle ground, if you will, between the OG Jitte and the Pip-Boy 3000 Jitte, but not really a Jitte.
Right. It was interesting because I was screaming to the high heavens that, oh my gosh, Wizards has done it again. But the pushback that I did get from the internet, and rightly so, and Lost did do this, was the counter portion. Because Pip-Boy does everything whenever that creature attacks. But it was kind of, you couldn't reserve these various effects. And the one that I was looking at in particular with Pip-Boy 3000 that just blew my mind was the check map, untap up to 2 target lands. I was equating that to the original OG Garuk. I was talking about the Pick-Boy, the Pick-a-Perk portion, and I was comparing that to what's the mono white card that puts the 1/1 counter type thing, or anything.
Luminarch Aspirant?
Yeah, Luminarch Aspirant. Thank you. And then sort inventory, I was kind of saying looter scooter. So I was saying you got a scooter, you got an aspirant, and you've got a little baby Garuk here, all running up in this little planeswalker of a card. And then along comes Lost Jitte that just has to add the counters that you can proliferate and do a lot more. Reserve it. Decide when you want to do it, choose your actions type stuff.
So let's ask, right? I'm going to put this out to both of you, right? May, start with you. How big of a deal it is, right, that you get to put the charge counters and sort of save it up on the original Umezawa's Jitte and the Lost Jitte compared to the Pip-Boy 3000? I have a definite feeling about this, but I'd like to know how you guys kind of feel about this. May, what do you think?
So I think that what's scary about equipment like this is that it can scale out of control if your opponent doesn't have any artifact interaction. Like, creature interaction's pretty commonplace in terms of drafting priority, but when it comes to artifacts, that tends to be sideboard, if any, if it comes up in your draft. And the problem is that when a Jitte or Lost Jitte or whatnot gets out of control, then it's much harder to answer. They can warp the game around them and whether or not you have an answer to them. So,
what's interesting about these three is the evaluation. We're going to first start with Umezawa's Jitte. Umezawa's Jitte needs to be, in my opinion, in the highest power cubes because we've seen that effect. It doesn't necessarily, I couldn't just roll that up in my artifact cube no more than our good friend Nathan could roll that up in the almost legendary. We saw what happened there.
I was going to say that was a great example of, and you can see why, right? It was at the time when the first incantation of this cube came around, it wasn't the almost legendary cube. It was the legendary cube. So he's looking for anything legendary. Umezawa's Jitte, an iconic card, a lot of fun factor around it, right? But definitely a warping kind of card. As May alluded to, this is something that can get very, very out of control very quickly. And we experienced that firsthand. We were actually at my place on my back deck. We were drafting his cube. And I remember hearing Anthony, I'm over there playing a game, and all of a sudden, I've just got Anthony, oh my God, freaking Umezawa's Jitte, what's this doing in this cube? Thinking, oh, Jitte, interesting. And then I get fortunate, so I go 2-0 and I play against our good friend Jason, who has drafted Jitte, pick one, pack one. No big surprises there. I'm thinking, okay, let's see. And it absolutely just destroyed me. And I'm talking games where I was way ahead, way ahead. All of a sudden, Jitte lands, and he's just gaining life, and he's removing my creatures, and he's making his creatures bigger. And that cube was very sort of turning creatures sideways centric, right? So you just got to that point where Jitte just took over the game. There was just no way to avoid it, right? Outside of removal. And I made a huge mistake. One game, I had a Boseiju in hand. I could have channeled it to remove the Jitte, but I saw a line to try and go for a win rather than remove the Jitte before it got out of control. And unfortunately, Jason had an answer to what I was going to use to try and win the game. Jitte then again just took over control of the game.
Which brings up an interesting point with all three of these is that, and the context matters, that gray area that nobody wants to discuss, how these cards on their individual spectrums, I would say all three of these are very powerful. I mean, you're looking at Umezawa's Jitte cost 2, equip for 2, so it's almost double. Lost Jitte is pay 1 colorless and equip 1, so it's 50% of the cost of the original Jitte as far as getting it on the creature. And then Pip-Boy kind of has the same, it's low tier, it's in the middle there, it's pay 1, equip for 2. That mana consumption does matter when you're making these decisions. Stu and I were kind of pre-gaming May, and we were talking about this idea of these are like really better, more informed auras where, you know, you try to put this on the creature, and if they overly invest, the natural reaction is to count their mana and then to remove the creature, to pseudo time walk them, if you will, for a lesser mana exchange. That's kind of the normal play. But when you get it down to these equip 2s, equip 1s, it becomes problematic on your decision making. But the contextualization that I have, I'm never going to add Umezawa's Jitte to my artifact cube. But if there was an environment where it would have the worst time surviving amidst the worlds of disenchant removes things, naturalize, which I've definitely lessened those, and or Manglehorns, it would have a harder time surviving, say, in the legendary cube that focuses more on the card needs to be a legendary, so that restriction kind of impedes the ability to even deal with this card. You had that one Boseiju card, that was your answer, but there are answers, but not as many, say, in my artifact cube where I've got this massive 60-70% of artifacts in the cube.
I agree, but I still don't think, honestly, that you can kind of excuse yourself from just thinking, okay, because there's ways to deal with it, that I think it's going to be less of a problem. It's too powerful, in my opinion, even with removal, for a card that is so strong like Jitte, to just say, even if I have plenty of opportunities to get rid of this card from the battlefield with whatever I've got in the rest of the cube, that I'm going to include it. I think it's dangerous.
So I did slot Pip-Boy into my artifact cube, May. And the reason why that's more appealing to me, it was when that counter conversation came up, I saw it being less, I guess, prohibitive in the cube. It wouldn't be a detriment to the cube, is what I'm trying to say in so many words. That the counters with my ability,
it retains the modality without being as impactful as Jitte. So I get it.
Yeah, even the Lost Jitte, though. How do you see? Let's talk about this now before we move on. If you had to rank these 1, 2, and 3, how would you do this, Stu? And I know number 1's pretty easy.
I think 1 is going to be Umezawa's Jitte, 2 is Lost Jitte, 3 is Pip-Boy 3000.
How about you, May?
I'm going to dare to say Lost Jitte deserves second and agree with Stu.
Yeah, I'm going to agree with Stu, too. Despite what I said, and the internet hates me, the minute I said, everybody put Pip-Boy. Now, my next follow-up question, do you feel that all three of these deserve a slot in a Powered Vintage Cube, Stu?
No. And there's a very simple reason why. You can't have 3 very, very close cards, I don't think, like this in a Vintage Cube. That's it. You can have multiple cards that, like wheel effects. You can have multiple creature removal effects. I just don't know if there's room or a necessity to have 3 of these in the same cube.
So it comes down to slot.
Is it a redundancy that's necessary for a vintage environment?
Yes.
Yeah, so that's kind of where I was going to go with this, is that kind of comes down to this 3 Jitte problem. I wanted to analyze these cards because they're interesting looking at it from the different dynamics and contextualizing them to the environment in which they lie, right? I'm looking at Umezawa goes to my Powered Vintage, Pip-Boy is in my Artifact Cube, and what do I do with this Lost Jitte? I've been considering it. Like, do I put this in my Powered Vintage Cube? Do I put this in my Artifact Cube? Does this go in my Fem Cube? I'm trying to find I think I want to pick this card up. I think it's powerful, but it's interesting that you both said that. I wanted the diversity too. They all kind of, each one of them is a little different, but each one of them still the same. And they kind of fill a similar role. And I think you checked exactly what I was thinking before I started this.
I think this is an interesting point that you bring up as well, right? Because you've mentioned in other episodes that your vintage environment was where all the most powerful cards go, right? And you're someone who has a care for the aesthetics of your cube. So you're looking for, okay, how much can I pick up a foil for of this fancy new card? And once it's sort of seen its time, or maybe the experiment is over, then it will drop down and go in one of your other cubes. That's a dangerous perspective to have on cards in general, but especially cards that, I mean, Jitte is a great example, right? If it comes a time and you have a larger list of your vintage cube and you're like, okay, Jitte, for whatever reason, I don't want to run Jitte in my vintage cube anymore. you're not just going to take Jitte out and just put it in any cube. Would you even put it in any cube is a question. Not just, oh, I've got this shiny Jitte, I want to put it in a cube. Similarly with, if you felt that Lost Jitte or Pip-Boy 3000 even was like, I don't really feel like they're viable or necessary for whatever cube that they're in. Because this isn't just vintage cascading down to one of your other cubes. It could be, it's not in my artifact cube, so I'm going to put it in the Fen cube or in my medal cube, my Munson cube, or whatever the case may be. So that's a great point to consider, I think, right? When contextually you're looking at cards like this. Alternatively, now do you start to evaluate these cards very, very differently? Because evaluating them from a vintage perspective, I think it used to be the case that, not to say that vintage was locked in, but I think if we go back to the power level discussions that we've had over the years, the power level has accelerated a lot, and the vintage cube from 4 or 5 years ago, which may have looked not a million miles away from a vintage cube that would have been 3, 4, 5 years prior to that, but now looks wildly different from a vintage cube that exists today. So maybe things like that maybe would have warranted like an immediate, gotta have it, gotta experiment with it, don't quite have that allure to them as much as they used to. Do you understand? Does that make a point?
The point's good, but also think about like the timelines of where we've talked about power creep a lot on the show. I mean, everybody knows about power creep, and it's because the constant inrush of releases, right, is going to happen.
Right.
But as the powered vintage cube, we've talked about this, mine's changed drastically over the last 5 years. It's escalated up. And as he mentioned, I've had cards that have waterfalled down into my other cubes because I want to find a home for them. And what's interesting about that idea is because the other cubes, because of the proliferation of Magic cards, have also escalated up in power level. Mm-hmm. They're not as flat as they used to be, unless I chose to keep my environment, my power bands super tight. But we've definitely seen things, and we'll talk about this in a later episode, where we've pushed the power level of the artifact cube. The horror cube kind of doesn't move much because it's very thematic, but the release of artifacts is quite regular. May, I know yours has kind of got the budgetary that kind of puts that timestamp on you. It's hard for you to break outside of that shell, so you don't have to worry about that. You understand what I'm saying? This cascading, this trickle down effect from one powerful cube into the next one that catches it?
Well, it's easy as, and I think people do that for like their commander decks as well, where it's, hey, I spent money on collecting these, and these are my fun toys. I enjoy playing with these, and now I can't put them in the original reason that I got them. But I want them to be somewhere because I got them. There's a reason I got them. I like them. And sometimes it's important to separate yourself from the toys and, you know, your toys, your pet projects, whatnot, and what's actually appropriate for your environment. And when it comes to evaluating these, it's important to understand that what these all can do for your environment is scale. And some environments are not capable of interacting with that.
Do you think there's a danger that someone out there might get emotionally attached to Lost Jitte because it has Jitte in the name?
Yeah, that happens. I mean, I've got a real world example. It's silly and it's completely off topic.
The reason why I mentioned that is because I would. I would be that person. Like, Jitte, gotta have it. It's a Jitte. It's iconic.
I learned that collectors, I did a trade one day at my local game store, Game Theory, shout out to them, and I went to do a trade in, and I brought, I want to say just everything had Lotus on it. It was like Lotus Petal, Lotus this, Lotus Field, I think it was. It was all these different Lotuses that I had. And they said that collectors like to just collect complete assortments, have binders full of names. So I can see when you start getting into this, you're kind of getting the nostalgia bait here a little bit, right? That Lost Jitte is, people are going to add that because Imazah Jitte has made its mark. Therefore, Lost Jitte must be. And I wouldn't see any qualms with running Lost Jitte in a Power Vintage Cube. It'll serve a purpose, especially like in a 540. This goes into a whole different topic where you start getting into these larger lists. You start getting into these 600 plus type cubes, then you don't necessarily see it during the draft anyway. So I could see back to what you're talking about. You don't want to have more of the same, but if you started having 1,000 lists, you started getting bigger, then I could run all three of these very comfortably. Mm-hmm. You start getting down to 360, then I'm going to choose Imazahs for the most powerful.
Right.
But if I'm going for thematic right now, Pip-Boy is going to rest quite comfortably. Going to find out. I made a joke on our Discord, May. I was talking about it. I'm going to put Pip-Boy in there, and someone says, do you think that's too good? I'm going to wait for the moans and the people getting upset during the UberCube event, which is happening April 27th. And if I hear anybody going, oh my gosh, this card is too powerful, and I get that feedback, as May stated, from multiple players, then we'll take action on it, right? But I think all three of these could probably find their way. I think all these are very draftable, very powerful. Hence the name of this episode, the 3 Jitte Problem.
They're going to find their homes.
Yeah, they're
in
not.
a lot of cubes.
One thing that I want to make clear is that there is a very strong distinction between why the Jittes are so strong and Pip-Boy isn't a true Jitte. Because, sure, you can put +1/+1 counters on your creature. Sure, the things that it can provide does scale well with the game. But Jittes let you remove those charge counters whenever you want. And what's scary about Lost Jitte is that you can just stack up a bunch of charge counters and then just dump them all to effectively untap all of your lands for that turn.
Yeah, I cannot agree with you anymore. The untapped target land is definitely the ability that gets me most excited. And this is where I kind of rate this as a number 2, but quite significantly down, because you're only getting 1 charge counter. If you got 2 charge counters on this, and you could charge that up twice, and then untap and tap your Tolarian Academy or your Gaia's Cradle, just from 1 combat step, that would be pretty busted if you could make that happen. Now, even 1
Referring
is
to
still
the
pretty
Pip-Boy,
busted.
that's exactly what we talked about.
But that's untap up to 2 target lands. So now you've got to have, but you don't necessarily have to have both.
No, you don't. You just untap your 2. You literally run it in a tempo control deck. You untap your 2 islands. You can hold up your counter magic.
One thing that is nice about Pip-Boy compared to the Jittes is that you don't actually have to connect with Pip-Boy.
That is nice.
So you can just have something stupid swing, and if you have just 1 impactful land, then you can just untap that 1 impactful land.
Yeah, we were actually, one of the things I was shouting out, I think I actually copied Pleasant Kenobi because we had kind of talked about this during an episode whenever we talked to him about the Fallout series coming out. And then I hit him up on Twitter and I said the next Jitte, and he's like, oh no, that's not the next Jitte. And then I just kept going I'm evangelizing the idea of Pip-Boy 3000. Like, everybody get your Pip-Boys. And I was actually debating on buying 2 of these, and I did just finally find a home for it. I think I came to the same conclusion all of you did, but I have not seen these cards in action. So if anybody has solved the 3 Jitte problem, we want to hear from you.
Look,
because this is wild.
I would be very excited to give any of them a whirl. I think untapping up to 2 target lands can definitely have its moments. I'm be very happy, again, if I can untap a Tolarian Academy and maybe not a Gaia's Cradle at the same turn, unless I've got something really huge I want to cast, but maybe a Tolarian Academy and an Urza Saga might be fun. Lotus Field is cool because then you've got that extra colored mana. But yeah, I think it would be fun.
Lost Jitte and Pip-Boy also like Urza Saga, adding to the problem.
Yes. Adding to the problem.
Speaking of equipment, I think that we should talk about the Kemba problem that you had before.
Yep, we've got an interesting here. We've tied into this. May, go ahead and tell them how you... May did an evaluation for me, as she does. She looks at cards. She does that multi-dimensional where sometimes, as the curator, we put on these little goggles, little side blinders, and we cloppity-clop down the street. And May does a really good job of just looking at my cubes and asking the tough questions. May, do you want to present this one, please?
Sure. So the Kemba that we're referring to, because I had to double check because there are now multiple Kembas. Hooray. Kemba Ka Regent is 1 white for a legendary cat cleric 2/4. At the beginning of your upkeep, create a 2/2 white cat creature token for each equipment attached to Kemba. So, at its floor, if you have no equipment, you're not able to stick anything, then you just have a 2/4 for 3. And that's not exactly fantastic. And my initial evaluation of it was, okay, what kind of package are you supporting to justify this ceiling? Is this worth drafting into? Is there enough tools for me to be able to build a deck around this 1 card? And the answer was probably not. But
in reference to the artifact cube, where as we've gotten these back to the Pip-Boys and all the things we've been talking about, we have gained more access to more equipment that's more readily available and requires attachment, opposed to what we're going to talk about in the future here, living equipment type stuff. So, yeah.
Here's the thing that's important to note, is that when you have these good equipment, so say if you put Pip-Boy in the artifact cube, right? What's stopping everybody else from just drafting that Pip-Boy? The deck that wants the Kemba isn't always going to have access to it, even if the density is there mathematically. Just because they're colorless. They can be put into any deck. They can generate value on their own. And when you are trying to build an entire strategy around a card like Kemba or whatnot, and this goes for trying to support equipment themes into your cube as a whole, is that you have to make sure that there are enough equipments to actually fit inside of that theme that only that theme wants.
I would agree 100%. This was the argument that you presented for me. We're going to talk about some other cards that I have that are a lot more open and diverse, and they do something back to the floor. This is a 2/4 French vanilla card that required you not to compete with oftentimes before, but in the Wayback Machine, those colorless pieces of equipment that other decks also wanted to. But as we've migrated, you want to talk about this great sort of tier? I think now's an appropriate time because it does kind of blend with Kemba a little bit better in the story.
Oh, absolutely. Because Great Sword of Tyr is something that I would consider great for a deck that would include Kemba. And not every deck wants Great Sword of Tyr because it has a color restriction. But the reason I wanted to mention Great Sword of Tyr in this specific episode is that, like the Jittes, it also scales. But the way that it does it isn't through modality per se, but rather because it creates a constant pressure of every turn I get to tap down one of your blockers, whatever your most relevant thing is that could stop me, now just getting tapped down. And then every time I attack, my thing gets bigger. And in low power environments, that kind of scaling is enough to take over games. What ended up happening to you with Jitte and those other environments is a similar thing to what happened with Great Sword of Tyr in a lot of my environments, where it's just very good to have scaling equipment, but sometimes it can be too good if you don't have enough answer cards. So
I would agree. It also automatically equipped. It did a lot of things. It didn't require you to pay that additional cost, but it also wasn't in direct competition with that colorless slot. But this is a little bit of an all over the place type of thing. I do want to encourage the listeners. It's not our best work. We've joked about this. Stu and I we're coming up on our 100th soon. Our very first episode was The Swords of Fallen Favor.
I think it's some of our best work.
It's some of our best work.
It's very good work.
It's on the list.
We haven't really done any bad work.
The editing wasn't great.
That's not true.
I don't know about all that. There's ums and ahs and
good cards. And,
we get better.
Things have improved. We added a superior podcast host, and I think we got slightly better microphones and a new light. So I think those by itself is enough to make a better podcast. We also increased
the size of the screen so I can actually read the cards, so that really was helpful. But during that particular episode, what we talked about was kind of the problematic situation with the swords, with their appended cost, which I believe was 3. They gave you some form of protection. Then you had to pay 2. So it was like this 2-turn, if not 1-turn investment of 5. Then you had to have the creature requirement. And it did all the things, that trappy stuff we talked about, that auras sometimes fall into, that the players would wait for you to pay that cost and then try to equip, and then they would remove your target, buying themselves some time.
I think it's maybe just fair to say, to round it up and just say, the game has evolved outside of pay 3 for an equipment and then pay 2 to equip it and then have to turn the creature sideways that is equipped with. The game is too fast for that nowadays, right?
I agree with Steve.
And I think that if you want to develop a cube where that is not unreasonable, I can certainly see, let's say, for example, you've got a very tokeny based cube, right? Where maybe not the power and toughness of the tokens by themselves is particularly exciting, but there's enough equipment and swords that can really power a drafter towards victory, right? That there's a real good reason for wanting to pick them up. And they're pretty fun, right? Because it's not just that I'm making my creature bigger. Who doesn't like making their creatures bigger? But there's alternate abilities that are attached to them, right? So it could be that you untap all of your lands, or you get to do a bit of extra damage, or you draw a card. So they're not unfun, and I definitely think there's homes for them. But I think, and maybe this is what you're alluding to, Anthony, May, and you as well, is that maybe for the most part, if you're looking at a mid to high power cube environment, they're just not powerful enough anymore.
I would agree with that. Like the evolution or how Magic has increased in power level 2024, say to even pre-2020, we can see the difference where we were quite okay with attaching the equipment, paying the additional cost, treating it aura-like to get that added benefit of said artifact. Whereas now we're gonna kind of move into this in the episode. You can see where now players want the equipment to either enter and be its own entity, have its own creature, be able to attack the next turn, and or just snap to an existing creature.
I agree, but let me take it one step further, right? So many, many years ago, maybe 9-10 years ago right now, I bought a new video game. I was really, really excited because I hadn't played much first-person shooters for a while. And I loved Counter-Strike. So I bought Counter-Strike Global Offensive. It was the newest, latest and greatest at the time. And I started playing. And myself being someone who had watched a lot of professional games and we decided I kind of to want to be a little bit of a student of it, as much as I never expected me to be very good. But what I did was I went out and there's, for anyone who's not familiar with Counter-Strike, there's a lot of mechanics within the game, right? So it's not just about can you click on heads, it's about learning lineups for utility and learning how spray patterns work and all this kind of stuff, right? So I go out and I spend a few weeks, maybe, if not a little longer, learning those ins and outs of the game. And I play my first matchmaking game, right? Which is kind of like the competitive style. And I had people asking me like, oh my gosh, dude, are you playing on like a Smurf account? The Smurf is like a good player will create a brand new account to either go back through the game again or whatever. I said, no, I just kind of put my time in. I've learned. And I started ascending up the ranks pretty quickly. I stopped playing for quite a long time. And I go back to playing again. I'm like, I'm going to do the same again, kind of relearn the spray patterns and all this kind of stuff. And I am just getting destroyed. The game isn't any different, but the players are better. And maybe that's more that what we're looking at with something like these swords, right? The game might have evolved past where these are going to be at any kind of high power level, but do the majority of the player base, right? Many years ago, they probably would have got excited about going through a draft and picking a sword and then putting on a creature and seeing if can I swing with this? Can I untap my lands? Can I do that extra damage or draw a card? Does that excite the players now, or have the players, and not just the game, but have the players evolve past the point where something like that is exciting for them?
I would agree with that 100%. Now, I want to say that Cube is whatever, we've talked about this before, Cube is whatever you want Cube to be, right? Mm-hmm. So if you're running Kimba Ka Regent in your Cube and you're listening to this episode and it doesn't apply to you, that's because you've made a very calculated and correct choice to make your power band where it's at. But if you're following the trend of where Magic cards have now traversed over time, this is where we're at. I think you hit as May said, it was the nail hit the hammer on the head. But you've kind of driven that point home, is that players want it now. 2024 is everything we look at now is ETB. Everything we look at is does a thing when it enters the battlefield. We've talked about this age of Bane Slayers and Mole Drifters and how people have coined these terms.
Well, compare this right now, right?
Yeah.
Compare this card. Not 100% sure, but maybe someone can confirm. Was this in the Commander 17 pre-con cat green-white deck?
Probably.
Maybe. I've got a feel. I know I own this card. I'm pretty sure it is, right? Take the power level of those precons. Now, I remember the only two precons of Commander I ever bought was those two 2017 decks. It was the Cat deck and the Vampire deck. Good old Edgar Markov. And there's a ton of value in those right now because of a few cards, very, very powerful cards that are in there. Now take those precons, right, those older precons, and compare them to some of the precons that they're printing now. Because I know for a fact, we've had some of our play group show up, maybe not in the last couple of years, but I know looking at the lists and just remembering Commander games from a couple of years ago where someone would show up and they'd say, hey, I bought this precon. I really didn't do a whole lot with it, but I'd like to give it a whirl. I say, okay, cool. And I would pull out one of my decks that maybe I hadn't played for a while, but definitely was a pretty powerful deck back then. And I'm just getting destroyed. So we're not even just talking about necessarily the cards. We're talking about every facet of the game is now leveling up, right? The Commander precons, Modern, Legacy, Vintage, every format is seeing this acceleration. And it's just the excitement and the power level and what do all of these even individual cards do. And that's maybe an expectation level now that we have to deal with as you guys as Cube curators and me as someone who, well, for some reason sits here and talks into this microphone for about an hour and a half each week, right? It's something that has to be considered by, you guys out there, you're curators. Tell me how that sort of fits in with your philosophies as you continue.
Well, I want to add something that this is directed towards you. Let's go back to the 3 Jitte problem we talked about before. We're going to harp on that a little bit more. Roll back in time 5 years and now look at all those cards, removing Umezawa's Jitte, which was a known entity then, known quantity. But you look at those other 2 cards, and had they come out 5 years ago, people would have lost their minds. Now people are looking at this power evaluation, the ceilings and floors. The ceilings are astronomical now, right? The expectation, the efficiency levels.
Exactly.
What does it do for me now? That's what players want. So equipment is definitely falling into that. Would you agree with that, May?
Oh, absolutely. It's the reason why that a lot of the designs nowadays have been equipment that comes in already attached, or when something enters, then it already attaches, and whatnot. But in the cases of Jitte, what's difficult about its slots in a lot of environments is, like Stu alluded to, you have to pay for the Jitte, you have to pay for the equip cost, and then you have to be able to attack with it. But Jitte is so powerful and overwhelming that it's worth that amount of setup. It's its own payoff for it. However, so what's hard about Pip-Boy is that it has an equip cost of 2. And that is not irrelevant. So when you are putting it in, say, the same pack where you have a Jitte and then you have Pip-Boy, sure, Jitte comes down for 2 and Pip-Boy comes down for 1, but you're still having to equip them for 2. By the time that they come down, you're having to spend 3 versus 4 mana, which that's a big difference in Magic, right?
It is.
It is today, 2024.
It is.
It definitely is today. My point is that when you're looking at these strong modal effects, depending on what your environment is looking for, you have to ask yourself, is something like a Jitte appropriate for my environment? Is something like Lost Jitte, is that appropriate? Is it even worth having a second kind of worse Jitte, but like it's still a good card, you know? Equipment decks are going to struggle nowadays, and the way that you can support them is with some of the cards that you've put into the show notes here, where it's things that reduce the costs, or things that make it equipped for free, and ways that you can cheat things in, and classic cards like Stoneforge Mystic. You're looking for ways to get that equipment into play, to get it consistently, and cheat it. Nowadays, it's just too important to be able to skip on those costs for it to be relevant. And when you're cheating on those, you want to make sure that what you're cheating is worth it. There's a reason why, what is it called? Colossal Hammer became a card in Modern for a bit, just because, oh, hey, this makes my thing +10/+10, and if I can cheat it in, then that's a pretty good payoff.
It's still a good payoff.
There's a reason
why. It's a bonkers card.
Colossal Hammer has been on my radar forever, and I actually decided not to run Colossal Hammer in my artifact cube.
Just for clarification, it's Colossus Hammer.
Colossus Hammer.
Colossus.
I
couldn't remember the name of it.
It's a big hammer.
It's a big hammer. You can't fly with it because it's so dang
and
heavy.
I will have to add that to the show notes afterwards. I don't have it in front of me. But the reason why I chose not to run that card is because I saw how devastating that card was in our good friend, ChillMTG's Dragons of Winter Nights package, where he was basically had ways like Pure Steel Paladin for 2 white. You get a creature, human knight, and I've got this sweet Fallout art now in my... I'm so excited.
Very cool.
Very, very metal.
Very cool.
Whenever an equipment enters the battlefield under your control, you may draw a card. And Metalcraft, equipment you control have equipped 0 as long as you control 3 or more artifacts for a 2/2. Not hard to do 3 or more artifacts in an artifact cube. Not very hard to do 3 or more artifacts in a lot of cubes nowadays because there's such a plethora of them. So the responsibility really comes down to the curator to monitor these type cards. Because you can see where you're doing Colossal Hammer. Did I get that right that time?
No.
Colossus Hammer?
Correct.
One of those hammers. You can see the problem where something like that, if I could just, what is it? It's huge. It's a 10/10?
It's +10/+10. And
you can't fly.
You can't, creature loses flying.
It's enough to just be, like, if you could do that for 0, it's insane. And it's problematic.
Exactly.
And I've chose to just avoid that card altogether just because I saw how it played out in that environment. But believe me that I looked at it multiple times and then just said, nay.
I mean, just go check out the Modern Hammer Time list if you want to see some of those enablers, right? Not just the enablers, but the protective cards as well. I want to go back. I know, look, to whoever has said, you guys bounce around too much. I'm going to apologize in advance. We're going to go back very, very briefly to Kemba Car Region. Now, I was not part of the discussion between May and Anthony as to why this card should be removed. So, Anthony, I'll start with you. How many equipments are in your artifact cube?
I don't know. I don't have the list in front of me right now.
Okay,
We're going to go with 14. That's a good number.
Let's go. Let me ask you another question. May asked you why you were running this card, and essentially you had a discussion and decided to remove it.
Yeah, I was trying to overly support the... I now have a lot of equipment in there because I wanted to push it a little harder.
Do you? What is a lot? Because how many cards is the cube?
360.
360. Okay.
You already checked this. You know this information.
Absolutely, I do.
You're testing me now.
Absolutely.
I haven't looked at this list in forever.
It's over 20.
Yeah, that's a lot.
It is a lot. So let's first of all go with Kemba's a 2/4 for 3. I don't mind that. I don't mind that on a body. Is it fun?
It's fun, but I also think it's slow.
Is it fun? Do you think this is something that's fun?
I think it's very dated. I think the beginning of your upkeep, it just does not keep up with the things I'm doing now. That's what's happened. This power creep, going back to our original thing we said where the cubes kind of went up and we got this cascading waterfalls down type thing. This cube has also moved up too.
So what you haven't done is what we always talk about when we have these discussions about removing and adding cards. What did you replace it with?
I don't have that on the list right now. We're going to say something better.
Something better. I mean, I would hope you would think it was something better, right?
I do have a sort of point to drive home when it comes to Kemba and Jittes and whatnot, and it is a phrase that I've been coining for a lot of cube design space, and it is the juice worth the squeeze? Jittes are worth the squeeze because they scale. The impact that they have, it can be at an instant speed. You can remove those charge counters whenever you want. It's worth building up. The payoff is there. However, when you look at Kemba, is that juice worth the squeeze? You just drafted it. You got enough equipment. You now have the Kemba. Whether or not you get it into play, you'll probably be okay with it. Let's say best case scenario, it doesn't immediately die at sorcery speed, right? Do you feel bad playing it? And is it worth the squeeze? Right? If everything goes right and Kemba manages to go back to your upkeep, how many equipments that you put on for it to feel worth it in today's day and age? It's a fun commander card. Don't get me wrong. It is a fun commander Kemba card as a card.
Hey, you're not getting any argument on me. Like the first time you pitched this to me and you just did it, you did this in multi-segment just now, but that is about as clean as you did it to me on the first time. You told me every little argument piece you've given me, and it was so much that I had nothing but go, okay, yeah, that's going. Because it was so hyper dependent on not just one, but two. How much do you want to stack on it in order to get
one
that?
Or two? One or two.
It was the juice versus the squeeze conversation. She literally hit that. It was direct.
Did you come to a consensus on how many equipment you would need to put on this card in order to get value out of it?
It would be at least 3, and then you have to.
You need to get 3 2/2s a turn to make that worthwhile.
You have to hope that the card even survives based on all the investment you've made to equip. There was so many dynamics to this evaluation.
Yeah. You're not wrong, but that's also a dies to removal kind of argument, and I'm not buying it.
Oh yeah,
yeah, that's fair.
Absolutely. But my point is that. Is the amount of fun that you're generating saying that you got it together, you now have all of these equipment to put it on, you now have a bunch of cats. Now what?
While I'm swinging with those cats and winning.
Or you had to wait till your upkeep and you're dead because you got stuff like...
Am I? I had a 2/4.
I want to talk about this next card.
I had a 2/4.
We talked about the mana reduction. Stu's hung up on this Kemba.
I had a 2/4.
He did defend
You're
this Kemba.
You're going to have to convince me much better than that. Rather than it dies to removal, and I need 3 2/2s per turn to make this viable, because I'm going to say that's absolute nonsense. If I get 1 2/2 out of that, and I can just send it with my, what is it, from 2/4 to what, 3/5? 4/6? Like, what equipment do I have on it? Then what are you going to do? Are you going to destroy it, and then I'll just put that equipment on my 2/2 that I got for free and start swinging again? Where's your removal now? Oh, you got 2 removal? That's okay. I only spent 2 cards on that.
I like your argument, but hers is better. I literally landed where she landed. She made such a proposal as far as that stacking was required to get that value. So I can see both points. They're fair. Kind of falls in that conundrum of, and it also kind of fell into this interesting dynamic too, that it is a signpost, right? It really screams, hey, I want equipment. It was overly specific about what it required. That ultimately boiled down to that. It was a 2/4. May said it. Or you put equipment on it. That was it. That was no other options. It wasn't dynamic. It wasn't interesting. The payoff is real. The ceiling is extremely high if you overly invest in it, but the floor was so low in comparison to this next card that I want Stu to talk about.
So this one is Forensic Gadgeteer. So this is a new-ish card.
Blue gets everything.
Blue really does get everything. So this is a legit like vintage power level cube card. So Forensic Gadgeteer, 2 colorless and a blue for a Vidalcan Artificer Detective. It has, whenever you cast an artifact spell, Investigate, activated abilities of artifacts you control cost 1 less to activate. This effect can't reduce the mana in that cost to less than 1 mana, which is interesting. Less than 1 rather than like, well, actually, no, that's not interesting.
It's not. It's the opposite. But it can't
It
zero.
usually says 0, doesn't it?
It reduces
it.
it.
One more to turn all of
that's
your
different language.
artifacts into cantrips.
I like that.
It's still
That's good value.
And it's a 2/3.
So it's not part of the equipment deck, but by being so broad, going back to our parasitic conversation we had, we talked about this. Like, this card actually does a lot more. You can equip this, but it also just has your payoff for playing the game. Like in a Powered Vintage Cube where you're dropping Moxen, maybe late game, don't know why you're doing it, you get payoffs. But in an Artifact Cube, you continuously get payoffs. So I am actually dangerously testing this card in my artifact cube. We've talked about this. This may be my next Kappa Cannoneer.
It's interesting that you say that, because you know what I'm seeing a lot of in the vintage environments is Kappa Cannoneer.
Yeah.
It's a pretty straightforward to get out card, right? Cheap and cheerful, and cheated out, and you're just growing every time you play an artifact. So it's a legitimate card in vintage environments. I think this is a card that I would be personally quite careful about with putting in your artifact.
It's in there. I'm doing it, and kind of going off. Yeah, I'm doing it. We went all in. As a matter of fact, this because it combos off Basalt Monolith, but the payoffs aren't there. We did evaluate this because this is actually a tangential conversation aside from equipment and the problem we're talking about. I did recently add Metalworker to the artifact cube.
Love that.
But the argument is because, hey, Anthony's already added this infinite combo and multiple infinite combos, say with infinite Basalt Monoliths. But the evaluations, say from our good friend Jazarios, who looked at my cube, said, well, the payoffs aren't there. The juice isn't necessarily worth the squeeze. Sure, you can go infinite, but what are you going to do with all this colorless mana in that environment? That's always an evaluation point. You can do a lot of broken things, but ultimately, what do you do with what you've generated with the broken thing, right? And that's kind of where I landed on this card. I want to ask both of you, and I'm a holdout for this card, but in this day and age of equipment, going back to the equipment idea, Forensic Gadgeteer doing the reduction of cost and giving you this payoff and does the thing. Does Stoneforge Mystic still hold a candle?
Oh, absolutely. Because at the end of the day, Stoneforge Mystic literally lets you tutor for whatever you want. And if it manages to stick around, then you can cast your equipment at instant speed.
Yeah, I'm not arguing, but
that is really hard to compare
that's in
to,
the day
say,
and age,
Kemba, where you spent 3 to get your 2/4.
I 100% agree. That's in the current day and age where we're talking about now our equipment is ready and available, alive, and can attack and do things.
Let me phrase the conversation a little bit more of a Moldrifter versus Baneslayer type of lens. Okay, let's say I have a Bone Splitter in a pack, right? What type of environment needs to be fostered in order for me to be inclined to grab that Bone Splitter? Usually it's just, hey, that's an extra 2 damage that I can just pay 1 mana every time to make sure that I can get extra damage in. It doesn't need a bunch of bells and whistles in order to do that because it's so efficient at what it does. But as we've gone on, especially in the case of Lost Jitte, okay, cool, great. I can pay 1 for the equipment, 1 for the equip, and instead of just getting +2 once, then I can use it to untap lands, I can use it to +1/+1 counters, I can use it to stop things from blocking. It does so many other bells and whistles on top of what it does.
Stop reading my mind, May.
That is the juice that is worth it.
It's where we're at
Even
now.
though Jittes take time in the same way that Kemba takes time, the reason why Kemba's a nice comparison point here is that Jittes don't require anything else. They're their own built-in engine. They're their own built-in thing. They have that built-in modality and value and whatnot, everything that you want tacked on. And for what you're getting so much bang for your buck that even if it comes at a pace of once per turn, that's still a lot. And OG Jitte giving 2 counters is huge.
Yeah, so I want to kind of talk about, now the evolution of equipment. When we first talked about this, we talked about the swords, we've talked about the fall in favor, and how you had to pay the cost, and then you had to have the creature, and then you had to equip it. And once it came down, if they stuck, it was devastating. It truly was. You got to untap all your lands.
And they still can be.
They still very much can be with stuff like Stoneforge Mystic. But now we've moved into the interesting dynamic that the reevaluation of stuff like Living Weapon or For Mirrodin, or those type where it enters the battlefield where you can just do the thing now. The versatility, the dynamics of the card, they're more interesting. All these different ways you can just define these cards multi-dimensional opposed to I play sword has protection, you can't interact with me because you're the Izzet deck and I just happen to get the sword of
Sofa?
And you can't do nothing about it. You lose the Magic game. It's more
nice
the balancing of fairness too. There's a lot of balancing, a lot of cogs moving here in this story.
So I actually do think that I'm picking up what you're putting down. And yes, while we've gotten a lot more powerful effects, there's a huge difference between Bone Splitter and Lost Jitte, obviously. Agreed. But if we're going to sit down and ask which one's the more interesting card, of course it's the Lost Jitte, right? Of course it is. There's so many other things and decks that it can go into, and it does its own thing, that you feel good picking Lost Jitte. not every deck wants the Bone Splitter.
Yeah, aggro package wants the Bone Splitter. The other one could go into some unique control pattern, right? Pip-Boy can go into a control pattern, what I talked about before. Untap those 2 lands, hold up the 2 blue mana. You can just control the board with your tempo deck, right? I don't care if it's ninjas or whatever you're doing. That's what's interesting about the recontextualization of the expectation that Magic players, I think you landed that so well. What we want is happening. Our choices have changed. Now, this doesn't apply to every cube. Bone Splinter still is a rock star in a lot of cubes. And our good friend Sandwich and I just had a debate on this card, but Lost Jitte really does put a nail in the coffin for it in the higher powered cubes, in my opinion. If you're running Bone Splinter, Lost Jitte just does more options. Would you agree? I mean, I don't even have to ask May if she agrees. She just said it.
Yeah, any card that is not just, hey, I'm putting this equipment on this creature just to make it bigger or make it more of a threat when I'm turning that creature sideways or not, if I'm giving it vigilance, is going to be greater than the sum of a combat trick, right? Or just trying to win with combat damage. I agree 100%. Untapping lands is a new dynamic. Like you said, control shells will love it. Anything where you've got lands that do stuff are going to enjoy it, right? So, heck, I would love to be able to use my wasteland to cast something and then untap my wasteland and my strip mine and then destroy your lands. Like, that's great. So, yeah, there's always going to be context when there's new things that the card does rather than just, hey, I'm making my creature more of a threat.
The question that you should be asking yourself is, what does the card accomplish inside my environment?
I agree. So, what we're trying to say here is going back to the 3 Jitte Problem, or watch the 3 Body Problem on Netflix right now. Not affiliated with Netflix, but holy cow, is that an amazing show. Gotta read the books. You saw how we had this interesting debate amongst ourselves. Everybody had an interesting dynamic and how we evaluated Kimba and how equipment has evolved over time. And it's interesting to me how over the duration of Magic, people are looking back at some of the living weapon stuff. Cards that once would have been kind of poo-pooed upon, but now they realize they can get that value now with the Germ, for example, like something like Mortapod, which will be included in the show notes, or Batterskull.
I'd feel fantastic hitting a Stoneforge Mystic and then cheating out Batterskull.
I couldn't agree more.
Cauldra complete.
I think, well, Cauldra and Batterskull kind of are the poster children, right, for the living weapon. Yeah. I also think Nettlecyst. I know that Anthony is probably super excited. One day, I gave Anthony a stamped foil, like, when I opened Nettlecyst. I will admit right now, I thought, I'm not ever going to have a reason to play this card.
Now you want the card back?
Absolutely not, because the only thing I'm going to do with it is put it in a crappy Commander deck, and I don't play Commander really anymore, and I'm probably never going to play that deck again. But I love the fact that now that is a card that is exciting, that it certainly will have a home. It's got a vintage cube power level to it, in my opinion. Absolutely. It's a very, very strong card. But the living weapon stuff and the 4 Mirrodin stuff, you can always find a home for those cards, I feel, because yes, the Batterskulls and the Cauldra Completes are really at the high power level of that. But then you've got all these other choices and all these other themes and all these other arts that, depending on your cube, I don't think you're going to have too much trouble finding a reason to want to be able to run them if you've got any kind of desire to put an artifact/equipment theme in your cube. They're super fun, right? I actually will say, we talked about this a little bit in the pregame. I love the 4 Mirrodin. I love the fact that you get this 2/2 creature token as well. So it's more than just the 0/0 germ. So I think that's great. It's a cool new little upgraded mechanic part of the equipment, and why not? I think there's so many homes for it.
Tab note right here. Sorry to interject myself, but
do it.
It reconfigures fills a similar niche.
It does,
yeah, for sure.
It's a creature, and then later you can spend it to keep that value.
Exactly.
I love it. So, like, the evolution of equipment is insane because it doesn't feel so. Back to the original thing that I said, you pay 2, 3, 4, 5, you make set equipment, then you equip the equipment only to have it removed to feel the feel bads of the time walk because the opponent did a 1 mana kill spell, etc., right? Or a 2 mana kill spell that we see now today, right? These new equipments come down and they feel less risk. I guess the risk management has come down, right? They're less risk avert. And at the same time, they actually are more dynamic. And another spectrum that we have seen, this is kind of a closing thought, they're not back to what May said, where they're now they're very color centric. And that doesn't really create the contested feel that you have during the draft, right? Going back to the 3 Jitte problem we had between the Lost Jitte, and Pip-Boy 3000, the argument is that everybody's going to want that. If you run all 3 of them, they come across the draft, there's no reason not to take all 3 of them, hypothetically. Now you've got stuff like Blade of Shared Souls, and you've got Gold Warden's Helm, and you got Glimmerlands.
Dragonwing Glider.
These
Absolutely.
are amazing cards.
That's a great point, actually, about the color requirements, right? Because way back when artifacts were not completely necessarily, but were for the most part colorless. Now, having those little extra requirements, even something like Bladehold War Whip, which is a Boros card, so now you've got that little bit of extra restriction within your cube environment where you're pushing that towards the Boros side of things, whereas someone who's not in those colors is going to have trouble casting it and equipping it, rather than anybody can put Jitte or a Batterskull on their creature. So I just think that it adds to the flexibility and the fun of them. And I'm going to end on this. This is the last thing I'm going to say. You're both wrong about Kemba.
I'm okay being wrong about it.
So we're going to do a little bit of...
that it could be fun. So I'm willing to be wrong about it.
I'm going to make it fun.
I don't think
Put it back in. Give me an auto on that card. I'll make it fun.
So we're going to do a little bit of audience participation. Umasada Jitte, we know, is devastating.
It is.
I think it's if it's not known, you'll find out in your own play group.
Sure.
But now Lost Jitte and Pip-Boy, we want a little bit of audience participation. I would love to hear people just come back to us and rank these cards and tell us what environments you feel these are appropriate.
And tell us what they've done in those environments. Have they just been so backbreaking? Have they been incredibly interesting and opened up new play lines, new draft lines, new options for other alterations within your cube, what your power level is, the whole 9 yards? I think this is a great discussion point. Obviously, it's kind of focused on these 3 cards as far as this episode is concerned, but who knows what this might open up for other kinds of artifacts and other kinds of equipments.
And I want you to go ahead and tell me that the universe was wrong whenever I announced that Pip-Boy 3000 was the best.
The universe is never wrong.
Versus Lost Jitte
the universe,
a week and a half later.
The universe isn't going to use its valuable energy, entropy, in order to screw you over with this Lost Jitte.
You want to do some entropy?
It's got better. Yeah, exactly.
All right, so where you can see these cards, hopefully, will be at the UberCube event where we can hear players groan about them. That's happening on... I'm going to get all the feedbacks. It's going to be on April the 27th. We're planning on 64 players. I said 8 cubes. We've kind of divided that. Now, this is all based on how many people show up, ultimately, right? But I've actually expanded it beyond that. I've done a 8 round, and then now we're going to feature May's Fey Cube. You want to play the Fey Cube? You want to go for it? You want to just like try to push in that round 2, try to get into that powered vintage cube and not like it as much as the Fey Cube? This is how you're going to do it. Show up for the UberCube event. It's going to be in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, April 27th, and there's going to be prizes, karaoke. We're going to just have so much going on. We're going to have a great time. All 3 of us will be there. I am super excited to have May in town. It's going to be a blast. Got to show you all the cool stuff. Raleigh, North Carolina is awesome.
Come meet your favorite celebrity Magic/Cube podcast host, the latest, the greatest, Magic. She'll be there.
Wait, what?
Hi. Yeah,
she'll be there.
You want to get a Magic autograph?
Yeah. For any of you that has a Fey Cube clone, I'm sure May will be very, very happy to sign
all
every single one of your cards in that Fey Cube.
No,
she'll be so excited.
Let's move over to our
I am begging you. I will not sign all
every basic
cards.
land, every token. All right. So first of all, thank you to all of our listeners. Huge shout out to our Patreons, Keaton Schultz, Lord Justice, Chris Singer, Nick Lapointe, Stephen Conafalt, Preston, and Sam McKenna. Huge shout out. Much love to all of you guys for the ongoing support. Really means a lot. I'm getting so close to that new mic stand. The dents in it are just holding up right now, but it's going to happen pretty soon. I want to give a big shout out to our MTG drafting page on Facebook. We have our admin sitting right next to us, or one of the admins, Anthony, at facebook.com/groups/MTGCube. Same as in the Discord, man. You got some questions. You got looking for some advice. If you're a veteran or a brand new cube curator, whatever you're looking for, come check it out. A lot of activity going on there. Pretty cool stuff. As always, if you enjoyed this episode as well as any of the others, we would truly appreciate a 5-star review on your chosen podcast platform.
our 5-star reviews have gotten really great. I just want to say a thank you. Like, I've seen them. I've looked at them. Spotify, I see all the reviews coming in. I check all the metrics. Thank you so much to the community for helping us out. Really spreads the word. And then I look at Apple oftentimes, and then womp to Google. Now we're seeing YouTube. That's the new way.
It is.
You can find us on there as well. We actually have YouTube podcast, and we can find us on YouTube. I didn't actually differentiate, to be honest with you. I put videos, podcasts, same thing, but whatever. We're eventually going to add to the YouTube. But
I think we're thinking about some YouTube content.
If you're a Google podcast listener, it did move over to YouTube. That is an important point.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And as always, if you want to go and get some new bling for your cube, you can go use our affiliate link at altersleeves.com/UberCube. Get 5% off your purchase, or our Inked Gaming affiliate link. Go check them out. Place backs, dice bags, mouse pads, even all kinds of custom and even large volume products available.
If you come to the UberCube event, you can see the mistake I made by adding Metalworker with that sweet Alter Sleeves to my artifact cube. It's going to be either people are going to scream or they're not going to scream.
Nothing regarding Metalworker is a mistake.
The card looks amazing. Alter Sleeves.
It does. You can, as always, find us at Twitter. We are at UberCubeMTGPod. If you've got a longer question or comment about this episode or any other episode, you can hit us up at UberCubeMTGPodcast@gmail.com. And as always, go check out our Discord, #UberCube. But don't just type that in. Go check out our Twitter. We got links to the page.
Tell me how wrong I am. Please do.
And again, big thanks to all of our Patreons. We are at patreon.com/UberCube. And we're still sort of brainstorming some additional perks for our Patreons. But just want to give a huge shout out. Big thanks to you guys for the ongoing support. It means a huge amount to the channel. Thank you very much.
Other than that, we're going to say the thing that we always say here at UberCube is... Happy cubing, living equipment.